story, that lovely narrative, you worked on it, you know you're going to get an A on it, and then you add something else. 4 questions that lay over the top of the story that if I moused over them, I would get answers. One of those questions might be, what's new here? Who are the sources? Would be a second question. What's their evidence? What's missing from this story? And if I moused over those questions, the answers would pop up. You would be making your evidence, your reporting, actually easier to access than the whole story. It might pull me into the story, or it might actually say to me, oh, I got enough just from clicking over those things. I'm not going to read the story. But it says, my evidence is so valuable, I'm billboarding it like I would a headline. That, I think, has 3 significant advantages. One is your reporting is going to be better because you can't embed it or hide it and mask it inside a narrative. So you're going to have to do more reporting in the same way that the reporters in the New York Times and the Washington Post say, by naming the fact that we got 13 sources in this story, I can't have 5 in the next one. I have to keep raising the bar. So their reporting is getting deeper because they started enumerating it. The second advantage to this approach is one of the big issues in journalism is shaping the demand side. Make the audience smarter about the news they consume, and they'll consume better news. This kind of billboarding idea actually teaches news literacy organically. If I see these stories and these questions, these are basic news literacy questions. Who are the sources? What's the evidence? How do they know what they know? What do they not know? Et cetera, et cetera. If I encountered those questions as I'm encountering the news, I'm going to be gradually teaching myself news literacy as a consumer, not in a classroom, and and in real life and on a continuing basis. So it teaches news literacy organically. And the third thing is, it's not something that fake news can do. They can't say we have source, or the sources would be rather slim. This was, this is from a talk radio show that appeared last week or something like that. It's not as good as form sourcing. Okay. I'm going to now just do a little pivot and talk a little bit about something that I hope will be useful to you, which is last summer we gathered 25 journalists, many of them very young, whose work, they were doing work in accountability journalism, politics, but not always government, things where they were holding powerful people accountable. And we had identified through an app we have that they got way better traffic than most reporters who cover this kind of stuff. So they were really engaging, successful reporters covering serious things. They were people who were succeeding at what is in many ways the most challenging thing in journalism, which is how do you make the significant or the important interesting, right? In a lot of ways, that boils down to journalism, what the challenge of journalism. Easy to cover the championship hockey team, get a lot of traffic, doesn't mean you're a genius. But if you can make things that are a little more complicated, that really affect people's lives as interesting, you're on to something. So we gathered these folks together and tried to figure out what is it they're doing, and do they have any things in common that they're doing that are worth learning. In our app we had 56,000 stories, and we gathered these people together. I used the word "bafo" on the slide. The first thing that they told us, so we just listened to them for 2 days. It was a reporting exercise, and we distilled the things they told us. And the first one was, all 25 of these people meet the audience where they are. They're very adaptive to new technology. They were the first people to be in Instagram. They knew where their sources were. They knew where their readers were. They knew what times of day their readers were reading their stuff. And they were in tune with them. And some of these people were, one guy covered fishing in Virginia, and somebody else was a 22-year-old right out of school who was covering the school board in Washington State. But all of them were kind of where the audience was. The second thing they all had in common is they didn't think about one audience. They all had in their heads that they had multiple audiences. That there was, okay, this might be written, this piece, how do I make it relevant to actually the head of the school board? And how do I make it interesting to a kid who's in high school? And how do I make it interesting to somebody else? A parent, let's say. They were very conscious of this notion that they had multiple audiences and that they had to make stories interesting for people who knew hardly anything and people who knew a lot. And sometimes they would write the story for multiple audiences, and occasionally they'd say, you know what, I'm writing this one for the mayor. If only one person reads it, I don't care, as long as he reads it. Because that's how we're going to change something here. They were very astute about that, and it meant that they put a lot of effort into trying to contextualize the story and make sure that the information that those different audiences would want to know, would want to read. The net result was they had more audiences because they were kind of thinking about it beforehand when they were writing the story. In fact, this was a word cloud where we had them say, who are your audiences? And, you know, angry, smart, older, rowdy, bag. I don't know bag. But, you know, it was very freely done. The third thing they had in common was they really thought of themselves not as gatekeepers. They knew, their audiences knew a lot about this stuff, and that they spent a huge amount of time writing about the context of what was in their stories. In fact, many of them said that the lead paragraph of their story was much, much easier to write than these, what some people call the so what paragraph of the story. Why does this story matter? They said, you know, as they got into it, they would spend an hour and a half on the fourth paragraph and 5 minutes in the first paragraph. Because it was in the fourth paragraph that they were discovering for themselves why anybody would want to read this story. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Clayton Christensen? He's a disruption theorist at Harvard Business School, and he argues that what we think of in journalism as news, we should think of as jobs to do. Like, this story is not a news story to the consumer. This story is the thing that's going to help them do this other thing. Like, this restaurant review is helping me pick a good restaurant that's going to make my girlfriend happy with me. That's the job that it's doing. I should say my wife. I don't have her. This story over here is going to help me figure out where to put my money, because I got my first job and I suddenly have savings account, and like, do I put it in a savings account or do I put it in something else? I don't know how to do that. This story is going to help me do it. So he has this idea of jobs to do, and that news is not news in an undifferentiated way. It is a job to do for somebody. So they think a lot about what is this story doing that it's going to be job to do. And just one little bit of this. So these kind of stories take more effort, more enterprise, and stories with more enterprise in them that are not just daily stories perform 53% better across these 60 publications and those 500,000 stories that we analyze. So, you know, there's proof empirically that if you can do these things, you get more readership and longer readership than the rest. Another thing, the fourth thing these people who were doing work that had way higher engagement than their colleagues, was they thought about, am I being reactive or proactive in my story? What does that mean? If the schedule tells me that the such and such council is going to meet tomorrow to talk about X, I'll go cover it and see what happened. That is reactive. That's their agenda and you're reacting to it. If you say, the school board is about to consider the such and such, I wonder we did a story 2 days ahead about what problems people are having with this issue, and we run that story before the school board meets, that's proactive. We have this tag that we use with our partners, and we say, whose idea was this story? Was it your idea, or are you reacting to something? So if the mayor holds a press conference and you cover it, that's a reactive story. If the mayor holds a press conference and you do a story the next day about why the mayor didn't talk about X, Y, and Z, that was your idea. You're still reacting to the news conference, but with your own initiative. So that's an initiative story. These people do a lot of these initiative stories, and they perform 47% better than the average story. So you're a leader, you're thinking of things, and this idea of initiative also puts you in a different mode, because instead of saying, what are the people I'm covering about to do, you're thinking, what are my readers, my audience, my listeners, my viewers thinking about this issue? What's the question they have in their mind? So you're more reader or audience focused and less establishment official focused. And now all of a sudden you're thinking about, how do I help my reader? What jobs do they need to have done? And initiative is a big part of this. It's also, frankly, a whole lot more fun. Instead of your boss saying, go cover this, you're going to your boss and saying, I've got a really good idea for a story. It's probably going to be better because it's a story you thought of or that was worth doing. The fifth thing is their listeners. They got this idea that their audience is a community, that if they can listen to them, the whole idea of initiative stories, of what is it my readers would want to know, becomes much more of a real thing, right? I'm actually listening to them. I answer the Nimrod comments that they write at the bottom of my stories, and the angriest comment, I even answer that person. And what almost everybody sees, not 100%, but people stop trolling you when you respond to them. They're shocked that you responded. You begin to listen to them. They tell people, your traffic goes up. Suddenly, it's a community of people who are listening, and you can get ideas from them. I don't know how many of you were at this thing I taught last night, but I'll just very, very quickly tell the story of David Fahrenholt of the Washington Post. It's such a cool story that so Fahrenholt was asked to go cover President Trump's, or then candidate Trump's charity. And he did one story that started where he said, Trump said, I'm going to give $1 million to some veterans group through my charity. And he thought, I wonder if he ever gave that money. And he called up the Trump people, and they didn't answer him. They called up the veterans group, and they were a little vague. So he went on to Twitter, and he said, is anybody a member of this group? Does anybody know if they ever got the money? And he started using this Twitter community that he was developing. He ended up with dozens of thousands, 80,000 followers. He called them the Army of Strangers because they didn't know each other, and they didn't even actually know him. But they would be working with him in real life, in real time. And the most dramatic day during the campaign of the Army of Strangers was he saw records that the Trump Foundation had bought for $10,000 a portrait of Donald Trump. One of these big portraits with him in his hair and his suit. And he said, wow, okay, I wonder, I'd like to know where that portrait is, because if it's hanging in a private setting, it would be a violation of the law for the nonprofit to have paid for it, for Trump's charity to have paid for it. So the first thing he had to do was find out, what did that painting look like? And he says, has anybody ever seen this painting? And somebody said to Fahrenholt at the Post, well, if you use this particular Google search mechanism, you might be able to identify what the picture is. So we did. I don't remember that. It's like Google Art or something. And within about an hour, he had identified the picture, because there had been a picture of it on the internet at one point. And then he said, does anybody know where this is? Has anybody seen it? And this about 10 in the morning, and within a few hours, he gets from one of these 80,000 followers, somebody says, I think I saw that picture at the Doral Country Club in Florida hanging on a wall a year ago. He says, okay, well, I need to know if it's still there, because if it's not there and if it's in some nonprofit place, he's still not in violation of charitable law. So it's the biggest story in the world, but the use of the community to do it is fascinating. So he says, we now think, now it's about 6 o'clock at night, and he says, he's been at it since 10 in the morning. And he says, okay, out to his followers, all in real time. We think it's in this country club. Has anybody seen it recently there, like in the last week? And the anchorman for the local Spanish language television station in Florida, who follows Fahrenhold on Twitter, says, when I get off the news tonight at 11 o'clock, I'll go book a room at the Doral Country Club, and I'll go look around and see if it's there. Which he does, and he gets there at about 11:30, checks in, and he's wandering around, he doesn't see it, and there's cleaning crews at the club, and he's got this picture that Fahrenhold had unearthed from Google Art many hours earlier, and he says, have you ever seen this picture here? And a workman, they're both Hispanic, says, oh yes, it's in the pub. It's closed now, but I'll let you in. And so at midnight, this TV guy, TV anchorman, tweets back to Fahrenhold, I found the picture, here it is, and Fahrenhold had the story. Using his community of readers to be engaged, they did essentially the reporting, they did things for him. The process of the reporting was 100% transparent. The Trump people could not challenge the story in any way because they had seen it evolve in real time. And people who followed Fahrenhold were delighted. They felt like they were actually part of the news. So an extreme example of engaging with, I mean, the guy's, talk about engaged, he's got this enormous following, and they're not just followers. They're actually participants in his reporting. The other thing about these successful accountability reporters is they don't operate by the old style of reporters from my generation, which was the lone wolf. You would go off on your own and you would do things, and you'd come back, it would be raining, and you'd have your trench coat on, collar up, and you'd drop your copy on the copy desk and say, it's done, the mayor's going to jail. I'll see you in a week. Like in the detective story. It doesn't work that way. Now, it's these guys work collaboratively, and they say, hey, does anybody have any data on this? Does anybody know somebody who could help me crunch this data? I need data visualization on this. I need to illustrate this. What would be the best way of doing it? Would you look at my lead and see if it makes sense to somebody who's not been involved in my story? The collective, I mean, essentially, there is no one inside Apple or Google or Twitter or Facebook who doesn't work in teams. That theory of management and operation has pervaded the new economy, and it's pervading slowly the work of people who are doing more successful journalism, and they're doing it on their own. I mean, it's not like the editor at the Skagit Valley Herald, a paper of 6 people, told this young education reporter, who's 23, who was part of this group, she just figured this stuff out on her own and operates that way. And she's a superstar off the charts. She won't be there long because she's going to outgrow the bosses pretty quickly. And then, you'll like this one, this is the last one. They find ways to hide and do the work that they think is really important. The great problem, if any of you decide to go into working in news, is you're overworked. There's too much for you to do. And these successful young accountability journalists find ways to reserve time for things that they think are really valuable. And by the way, This is not that different than what really successful people do in any realm. I read a story in the Harvard Business Review on my way up here yesterday about how Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos and a host of other extremely successful people make time every day for them to just read a book and reflect and unplug. That if they didn't have this time for reflection, they wouldn't synthesize everything. They'd be buffeted by all the things. So these are the busiest people in the world, and they find time to just read and reflect and read books and slow down. Steve Jobs famously would have meetings by taking a long walk. He and another person, or maybe 2 or 3 other people, and they would go on an hour-and-a-half walk around Cupertino because it got them out of, the notion of the tight 15-minute meeting where somebody's bullshitting him and he doesn't really understand. And that many of the most creative things happen in those kinds of settings. So find ways to create those moments for you. And I mean, you guys are young, right? And you know how to kill time. But if you mapped, it's a pretty simple exercise. Map a week. Just make a little diary of what you did, and think about the time that you could steal for yourself. That might be nicer than that 3-hour binge of TV. I started writing novels when I was 55. I had something I'd always wanted to do, and I decided, well, shit, I got a couple hours before I go to work in the morning. If I use them, I wonder if maybe I could do that. And that's all it is. I found 2 hours in the morning. So you can find 2 hours in a day to do things that you want to do. And if it's in a work setting, it's the same thing as Google giving every employee 1 day out of 5 to work on a pet project. And many of the innovations inside Google come from that 20% of time that, because then you're working, then ideas are flowing up. Okay, these are just some stats that you don't really need to know. But watchdog reporting boosts engagement by this much, according to our data, major enterprise. You've seen these stats. 47, these are huge numbers of what you can do inside work that is otherwise ordinary and make it more successful. I talked about this. I talked about that. And I'll stop with that. I hope there's some questions.
Why don't we, let's take a 5-minute stretch break. And I forgot to do something that I always do. Does anyone have an idea? That is the first hand. Anyone have an idea what the song had to do with Tom's talk?
The song's called Truth and Honesty.
Truth and Honesty.